The city never slept. Bright neon lights flickered, car horns blared, and people moved in all directions, each lost in their own world. Somewhere in the middle of this chaos, on the corner of a busy street, sat a young woman. Her clothes were worn, her backpack torn at the edges, but her eyes still held a spark. Unlike the others who rushed past, she wasn't bitter. She wasn't begging or complaining. Instead, she sat there, humming to herself, watching the world like it was a stage, as if she was in on a joke no one else understood. Most people ignored her. Some glanced at her briefly before looking away, uncomfortable with the sight of someone struggling. But she didn't care. She had learned a long time ago that people's opinions didn't define her. She had her own rules, her own way of surviving. And if life had taught her one thing, it was that self-pity wouldn't get her anywhere. That's exactly what caught his attention. Ethan Caldwell was a man of power, of status, a millionaire whose name carried weight in the business world. He had built his empire from the ground up, and now he had everything: mansions, cars, a bank account overflowing with money. Yet, on most days, he felt nothing. Success, wealth, luxury. He had convinced himself that emotions were a weakness, that caring too much only led to disappointment. But tonight, something was different. As he stepped out of his sleek black car in front of an upscale restaurant, he saw her. Not because she was begging, not because she was making a scene, but because she was laughing. A genuine, unfiltered laugh that echoed above the noise of the city. It made no sense. How could someone with nothing seem happier than him? Intrigued, he found himself watching her. The way she casually stretched her arms, as if the sidewalk were her personal lounge, the way she tossed a witty remark to a passerby who scoffed at her, and most of all, the way she seemed completely, unapologetically herself. She caught him staring, like what you see, fancy man. She called out, smirking. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him like that, like he was just another person. Not a millionaire, not a businessman, not someone to impress. He could have ignored her, could have walked away without a second thought. But something about her made that impossible. So, against all logic, against everything he believed about status, wealth, and power, he took a step forward. And just like that, an unlikely story began. Ethan hadn't planned on stopping. He had meetings, a schedule, a carefully structured life that didn't allow for random conversations with strangers, especially not with a homeless woman sitting on the sidewalk, mocking him with a smirk. And yet, here he was, taking a step forward instead of turning away. The woman tilted her head, amused, out. Didn't think you'd actually come over, she said, crossing her arms. People like you usually just look and keep walking. He glanced at his watch. He should have been inside the restaurant by now, shaking hands with investors. Instead, he found himself standing in front of her, unsure of what to say. "You're different," he admitted. She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, so you do talk." Thought, maybe you were one of those rich guys who only speaks in stock market numbers. Despite himself, he chuckled. She was sharp, not afraid, not intimidated. He hadn't met someone like that in years. "What's your name?" he asked. Asterisk, she hesitated, then shrugged. "People call me Riley." "Is that your real name? Does it matter?" She shot back. He studied her, trying to piece her together. She looked young, early 20s. Maybe, but there was something in her eyes that made her seem older. Like she had already seen too much of the world. Riley leaned back against a brick wall behind her. "All right, Mr. Suit. You got my name. Your turn, Ethan." She smirked. "Figures. You look like an Ethan." He frowned. "What's that supposed to mean? You know?" She gestured vaguely. "Money. Power. Probably owns at least one company that sells overpriced coffee." That made him freely laugh, for the first time in weeks. There was something about her bluntness that made him forget about the weight of his responsibilities. If only for a moment, but just as quickly as the amusement came, reality set back in. He had no reason to be standing here. No reason to be talking to her. She was a stranger, and his world didn't mix with hers. He cleared his throat, adjusting his suit. "Well, it was interesting meeting you, Riley." She nodded, unsurprised. "Yeah, have fun at your fancy dinner, Ethan." He turned to leave, but as he walked away, something about her stuck with him. Maybe it was her confidence. Maybe it was the way she seemed more alive than anyone in that restaurant would be. Either way, he found himself thinking about her long. After that night, a few days passed before their paths crossed again. This time, it wasn't outside a restaurant. It was at a small coffee shop, one of those hidden gems tucked between high-end boutiques. He had stopped in to grab a quick espresso before a meeting, but as he stood in line, he heard a familiar voice. "I'm telling you, this coffee is basically robbery. $5 for a latte. I could make a better one with instant powder and a dream." Ethan turned and found Riley standing at the counter, arms crossed, debating with a barista. The barista sighed. "Do you want the coffee or not?" Riley glanced at the tip jar, then at her nearly empty pockets. Ethan could tell she was debating whether it was worth it. Before she could decide, he stepped forward. "I'll get it." She whipped around. "Oh, look who it is. Ethan, the millionaire." He smirked. you remembered. Hard to forget, a guy who looks like he walked out of a magazine ad for expensive watches. The barista, looking impatient, interrupted. Okay. So, are you paying? Ethan pulled out his card and handed it over. Riley eyed him, suspicious. Why? He shrugged. Because I can. She studied him, then sighed. All right, but don't think this means I owe you anything. He smiled. Wouldn't dream of it. They sat down at a small corner table, the rich scent of coffee surrounding them. So, Riley said, blowing on her latte, why is a guy like you wasting time with someone like me? He didn't know how to answer that. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was because, for the first time in years, someone had spoken to him without any expectations. Or maybe, just maybe, he was tired of the emptiness that came with his wealth. Over the next few weeks, their meetings became more frequent. Sometimes, he'd find her outside a cafe. Other times, she'd be on a park bench, scribbling in an old notebook. They talked about everything about life, about people, about the absurdity of the world. The more he learned about her, the more fascinated he became. Riley wasn't just some homeless woman trying to survive. She was smart. She had dreams. Once, she had even been in college, studying literature until life had knocked her down harder than she could recover from. Ethan found himself wanting to help. He had the means. He could get her a place to stay, a job, a fresh start. But every time he hinted at it, she shut him down. I don't need saving, she said one evening, sitting on the hood of his car as they watched the city lights. I just need a chance. But life wasn't that simple, because the more time they spent together, the more complicated things became. People started talking. Whispers spread in his business circles. His business partner pulled him aside one day and asked, "Why are you spending time with someone like her?" His assistant warned him, "This could hurt your reputation, sir." Even the media caught wind of it. Paparazzi snapped photos of them together, spinning wild stories. Some headlines called it a bizarre friendship. Others painted it as a scandal. And then the final blow came. A major investor threatened to pull out of a deal worth millions. We can't have our name associated with whatever this is, they said. Ethan was at a crossroads. Did he walk away from Riley, the one person who had made him feel alive again? Or did he risk everything, knowing the cost of going against the world he had built for himself? And what about Riley? What would happen when she found out just how much pressure was being put on him to leave her behind? The storm was coming, and neither of them were ready for it. Ethan sat alone in his office, the city's skyline stretching out before him, glowing against the night. The weight of everything pressed down on him. Investors, business partners, the media, everyone had an opinion, and none of them thought he should be spending time with Riley. They called it reckless, dangerous for his image, a distraction from what really mattered. But what really mattered? The numbers in his bank account, the empty meetings and corporate dinners. Believing that success was about power and status. And yet, in all those years, he had never felt as alive as he did sitting on a sidewalk with Riley, drinking bad coffee and talking about life. His phone buzzed. Another warning. This was his last chance to fix things. If he cut ties now, he could keep everything he had worked for. But if he didn't, he had no idea what would happen next. Riley, on the other hand, had already made up her mind. She had seen the way people looked at her when she was with Ethan, the whispers, the judgment. She didn't belong in his world, and she never would. She wasn't someone who fit neatly into a high society lifestyle, and she didn't want to be someone he had to defend. That night, she made a decision when Ethan showed up. At their usual spot, a quiet cafe, tucked away from the noise of the city, she was already waiting for him. But this time, she wasn't smiling. "This isn't going to work," she said simply. Ethan frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I mean us, Ethan. Whatever this is, you have your life. I have mine. And let's be real. They don't mix." Jaw tightened. "So, that's it? You're just walking away?" Riley sighed, looking down at her hands. "It's not just me, it's them. The people around you. They'll never accept this. And I don't want to be the reason you lose everything." Ran a hand through his hair. "You're not a reason. You're the only person who's ever made me question whether any of this even matters." She hesitated, her resolve wavering, but she forced herself to stay firm. "I appreciate everything you've done for me, but I don't need saving, Ethan, and I don't want to be someone's mistake." He exhaled sharply. "You think this is a mistake?" She looked at him, her expression soft but certain. "No, but I think it'll destroy you if you let it." Silence hung between them. The weight of unspoken words. The ache of knowing that sometimes, no matter how much two people care about each other, life doesn't make it easy for them to be together. And so, she left. Ethan could have chased after her, could have thrown away everything just to prove a point. But as he stood there, watching her walk away, he realized something. Loving someone didn't always mean holding on. Sometimes it meant letting go. Months passed. The media moved on. The investors stayed. Ethan's life returned to what it had been before, but he wasn't the same. One evening, as he walked through the city, he passed a small bookstore. Inside, a woman sat by the window, flipping through the pages of an old novel. Her hair was shorter now, her clothes a little different, but he'd recognize her anywhere. Riley, she had found a job, a place to stay. A new start, her terms. She looked up, as if sensing him there, and for a moment, their eyes met. She smiled. He smiled back. No words were needed. They had both found what they were looking for, and in the end, that was enough.